Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the talk on tone and humor in Dungeonmans, which is this slide. Yeah, okay, so this is not necessarily a humor talk. If you want that, you should just leave and YouTube the talk that he gave earlier today on Kingdom of Loathing, because it was amazing. In all seriousness, if you're interested in like how do I put funny into a game, then you really do need to watch that, because that is an excellent demonstration of that art, which we're going to go over some of that here. So what is Dungeonmans and who am I? It is a game, a roguelike, that was released in, well, it was originally around in 2009 on some roguelike forums. It came about as an indie project for myself when I left AAA in 2012. Kickstarted in 2013, shipped in 2014. I try to patch it as much as I can. And it's a pretty irreverent game about crushing monsters and taking their stuff. It doesn't cling to some of the real roguelike traditions of, you know, waxing things and eating things and covering your ears and stuff like. It's, people have called it almost a turn-based Diablo, which is kind of weird because Diablo was a turn-based game to start. But what we're going to do today is we're going to cover how Dungeonmans established a tone for gameplay and story. And we're going to take that tone and humor and apply it to the game correctly. I will explain some practical application in Dungeonmans, and then I will go over some humor danger zones, which are things that I almost fell into at certain points, and maybe I can share that with you guys. So what's the story of Dungeonmans, right? Well, okay, so I just beat down this big boss guy, and he came out, and then he's in a tower, and I got these fallen stars, and they're going to go in a thing, and well, okay, that's actually not the story. That's the player narrative. But when I ask people, what's the story, I get these things. I get people talking about their player narrative, which is very interesting, because what is the story of Dungeonmans? Right? This is the story of Dungeonmans. You know, there's legends, and people were cool long ago, and maybe you can be cool. Go do that. There isn't, I mean, there's a bad guy, and he has a name, but there's no real series of quests. There's no grand plot arcs and such. But I still wanted people to feel like they were in a story-based experience. And the challenge for myself is, am I really a good enough writer to come up with this great story-based experience? And I've seen so many indie games that have trailers that are like, in the world of Jibbajar, and oh, the Dark Lord, booty butts, and it's really difficult to get into that. And unless someone's a fantastic fiction writer, I'm done like 10 seconds in, and I know many people are too. Even if there's some pretty tight gameplay to be found, it's hard to invest in stuff that isn't excellent. So where did the player narrative actually come from? The people talk about, oh, I did this and did this and did this. The story of Dungeonmans, the legends and dope people from history, are part of the game's tone. I'm going to say that word a lot. Tone is what helped create a feel for Dungeonmans where players could do stuff and rise up on this cool trellis of gameplay, and their stories grew off that based on what the tone of the game was. So this is what I wanted, right? I'm like, well, if I'm going to do this and go all the way live, this is what I feel like a game by me has to be, at least my first one, right? That's big. I wanted adventure and humor, and it's heroic. You know, heroic means you don't die from starving. You die like with 1,000 pointy spears in you, like Boromir style. And there's adventure and exploration, and I wanted to feel like a tabletop game that you play with me. Because I love rolling dice, and I love playing tabletop, and I wanted to see if I could bring some of that feel into a game without making it like a serious business tabletop style RPG. I wanted it to be funny, but I wasn't looking for a whimsy goofball. And that's a tough line to walk, and I was like, well, how am I going to do this, right? How do I actually figure out what this is? So I stole, right? Because that's what you do. You steal from people who are better than you, and you come up with something, and you stand on the shoulders of giants while picking their pockets, right? That's the goal for this. So I decided to take other pieces of fiction and put them on effectively a graph, like a 2-axis line. And the first axis is humor, right? The comedy quotient. So I said, well, on the far left, you've got these very, not funny stories. And there is humor occasionally in Game of Thrones, but really it's terrible. It's about rape and dragons and death, and this is not a funny world. And Warhammer underneath it is also serious business. In the grim dark future, there was only war, and the Emperor kills 1,000 people a day. And on the far side, you have this really zany, goofy stuff. You've got, Dreadmore with its like vending machines that have food in them, and you have lutefisk gods and stuff that's really wild. And Monty Python is the same sort of deal. And the comedy quotient, you can see where I landed. I wanted to be kind of closer to funny, but not quite zany. But the arc in the bottom struck me as important too. What's the value of heroism? So on the far left, it doesn't matter if you're a hero. Everything still sucks, right? You can sacrifice yourself. You can beat the dragon, and then someone just comes up and kills you, and your family catches fire suddenly, and it's just terrible. But on the far side too, like, does heroism matter? No, because if you're brave and heroic, a foot comes down from the sky and stomps the bad guys, and then the movie ends, and nothing there has any weight to it. So part of heroic adventure was getting myself some weight there. So that's one axis. The second is the value of lore and setting. I want a story, but how important is it? So this isn't how much story we have. I mean, clearly there's nothing over here on the left. They're Pac-Man, Space Invaders, right? Get the amulet and then go crush a thing. Like, these are really simple things. On the far right, you have mist. Or if you don't pay attention to the story, you can't win. And so that's like super necessary story. Now, Skyrim, you're thinking, well, what the heck? That's Elder Scrolls, right? There's like a million miles of fiction for it. But to play Skyrim, some people just want to run around in a wedding dress and shout at dragons, right? That's the game. Yeah, that's the game. And they have a great time, and the game's built for it, so they don't need the story to succeed. I mean, it's cool, and it makes the experience more fun, but it's not necessary. So I wanted to go to the left of that. So now I've got these two axes, and there we go. We've got a target, right? When I put words into the game, I almost always want to make sure they're as close to that target as possible. And that, for me, became a razor of, does this work in the game? Not necessarily is it funny, but does it work in the game? Because not all the text can be funny. So here we go. That's my tone. Lighthearted, heroic adventure, right? It doesn't matter if your guy dies, another one shows up from the academy, and he's even stronger, and eventually you're just going to throw yourself at evil enough until evil gets bored and you win. And that's how people beat Dungeonmans usually. You're not a murder hobo. You're not a bad guy. You don't stab shopkeepers. You don't set fire to villages. That's just not what you do. But I still wanted to have some of the pulp and sometimes dark essence of Robert E. Howard, because I love his work. I love Cull and Conan and Solomon Kane. And those worlds feel cool. I think one of my favorite lines was like, the necromancer muttered an incantation that was old when Atlantis sank. And just, wow, I picture that. And I'm like, I get chills just singing that out loud. I love that concept, so I wanted to see if I could bring some of that in. Some of that text is too serious, so it wouldn't make the cut, but some of it could still work in a relatively heroic and sometimes lighthearted fashion. So what do we do, right? How do we bring tone and humor to the player? And the worst possible way, as indicated by the dumpster fire, is to shove it in their faces, right? This game is funny and all. Like, if you're really good at it, do that. But it doesn't work if you aren't trying to be totally zany off the wall. So this did not work for me at all in Dungeonmans. The second is say, well, okay, put funny in, put lore in, and just leave it along the critical path. So when you're doing stuff and you're finding things, you naturally see the story. It isn't forced on you, but you just see it as you go along, and that's pretty good. And I think that works for a lot of games out there. What I wanted to shoot for was taking all of that stuff, the tone and the humor in it, and sort of making it into something comfy. And that picture works because the fire is actually in the background. And what you really care about is the warm cup of gameplay tea. The fire just keeps you warm and happy while you're sitting there on your Barker Lounger drinking permadeath, right? So how did I start to do this in the game? So here's item naming and description and flavor. These are the easiest ways to get your tone across. Players see items all the time. They get excited about loot, they look through their inventory, they see what these things are. Now, it's silly to think, oh, a thick plank with a bent nail, like what? And then, that's your starting two-handed weapon. What sort of garbage is this? Well, if you've played a lot of tabletop games, you know that you can start from nothing, and it's kind of cool to work your way up from that. So even though it's funny, there is a level of heroism to say, I started with this thing I found in the trash. I ended up like covering in these giant bejazzled shoulders and like a five-handed sword and all this stuff. Like that's a heroic arc. But what I didn't want to do for my game, for the tone I selected, was go too crazy with zany. So you could have started with like a wet noodle. You could have started with a foam sword or one of those hammers that squeaks when you bop stuff. Like, that's also a weak weapon, but it's kind of goofy. You can't really hurt somebody with that unless you like choke it and put it in their mouth. Like, that's not going to work. But a big, thick plank. It's a thick plank, right? So you can do a lot of things to bad people with a thick plank. This is one of the things I'm most happy about. If you are of sufficient level in Dungeonmans and die, you leave a little pyre behind with a sword and flames, and it's totally ripped off from the game over screen from Rastan, if you know what that is. You go to that, and you may find a weapon your previous character dropped. So legends are important is a big deal for me, and now you're part of it. The name of your previous hero is there. And if you don't know, in Dungeonmans, you can't use the same name twice. When you name somebody that name, they go and they're in. And you have to name before you roll character stats. So sometimes people name their character, they roll dice, they don't like what they see, and there's no reroll option. There's an option that says, this person is no Dungeonmans. And if you tell them, get gone, that name actually gets stored to be an NPC later. He might be a shopkeeper. He might be a bandit who runs one of the blockades. Because he's like, well, I was almost a dungeon man, but screw those guys. And then he gets his revenge. And then people will go to name their next character the same guy, like Rodrigo, and it's like, you said Rodrigo is no Dungeonmans. Like, that's the error message. That has generated a bit of angry mail. There was one of my favorite negative Steam reviews was, and you can't even name two heroes with the same name, ridiculous. And I just like saying ridiculous now to remind myself of that. I am totally cool with him calling it ridiculous. The game's not for him. But here, legends matter. Heroes are important. So you've got this whole item. There's some funny text at the bottom. It's not too zany, but it does kind of keep things lighthearted. There's a star symbol in the right-hand corner. I don't really go over this in the talk, but the further to the right that star list is, the more powerful the weapon is, the less goofy it is, and the less kind of funny it is. And sometimes the really high-tier stuff can almost feel maybe too serious, I think, and JRPG style, like it's the sword that came from a star, and it cuts gods into sushi, and whatever. I mean, that's cool, though. It's powerful, and I want people to have that heroic arc. Wildlife, right? You have a tone for adventure, heroic adventure, that's kind of zany, so you get this, right? It's funny, but it's not like way goofball. I mean, the Trigger, maybe. I don't know. But like, there's an ecology, right? Like the top Trigger, the top one is the brains. And you know, he's the one who kind of controls it. The middle one is the cunning schemer, and the bottom one is the brute. And these creatures, I mean, everyone's seen rats in dungeons, and everyone's fought mud crabs, so there's a crab rat, why not? And sure, that's not a real thing, but you think about that showing up in a dungeon, and you're gonna fight that, right? And if something's like a smiling blob of happy, like Dragon Warrior rules, but their slimes are little balls of smiles. And great for some games, but not for mine. I totally took a feel from Hackmaster and Knights of the Dinner Table, some of my favorite fiction. Their stuff is always like regular D&D, but one notch higher. So when they name their monsters, it's like real field guides. The Viridian-helmed Pounce Biter. We stalked him in the woods until one day he jumped behind me and I'm actually dead because he bit me in half. Like, that's the sort of feel I wanted for these monsters. So they all have names like that, and they feel like beasts in the wild. I wanted to make sure that the creature felt right. And so there's the axis again. Like, this is a cool bat. Actually, it's prettier than I scaled it up to because I'm bad at slide, but it's realistic. You know, that's like a real bat, so okay. But you know, you've got the venom-tipped cave flapper, right? And that guy, I mean, he can't actually fly, right? That tail would mean he can't fly. His wings are too dumb, and it's not going to happen. But he's the bad guy in Dungeonmans, and then on the far right, you know, I had a suggestion for a while, like, well, your game's funny. You should do funny monsters, and it didn't feel right. So again, I had a tone, I had a target, and things get cut along that point. Now there's big bad guys, and they can't be too silly, right? If you fight like Clownicus the Goofy, some games that works great, you know, and it just didn't feel right for me. So I wanted to still have the heroic arc of you're fighting these big beefy dudes, and you know, they're just, the whole thing is a setup, like you're at the top of a tower and you're actually fighting on the roof of the tower and you can't knock him off the tower because that's cheap, so I clipped the sides, but like, yeah, it's this big deal. But these creatures are actually kind of boosted from Golden Axe. Like, I love that game, and yeah. Like, I told my artist, I'm like, you know that guy over there, can he be baller and have like 2 axes? Why not? So we did this. And to me, saying, you know, the feeling of playing that game and how cool it felt to fight these big guys, I want people to feel that, and I want to pull from games of yore. So I did. The names of locations, especially if you're making procedurally generated worlds, can really, really, really help you out. Now, proc gen means you make a lot of stuff and it's different from game to game. It won't often be memorable. If you have like a solid overworld that's the same every time, or static overworld, sure. But what I wanted to do was make places that felt a certain way. So legends are important. The places usually have a name in them, and you see these names repeatedly, and there's a list of like 30. And they're great villains, great heroes, generals, maybe they ascended to divinity, who knows, but they did things in the past. And we hardly remember what they were, but we know greatness happened here. So that is the theme for regular dungeon names. I also have different types. There's bandit camps, right? And they have bandit camp names, and they're hiding in the woods. And then there's caves full of lizardmens, right? And they have these names, and you're not going to remember, like, no one remembers that, right? But you get the concept, and you see the name, and you get the feeling like, yes, a dung waste, right? I mean, that's terrible. And who wants to be in a dung waste? Well, these lizards do, so they have to die, right? And that's, they're just wrong. And they live in poop, and you want to save them from that. So you get the feeling of what the locations evoke without having to remember the names. The last two are also, bandits will block the road sometimes. They'll make these roadblocks, and they have names like the Battle of this and that, and the music is epic. You jump right in, and you crush the guys down. There's nothing to explore. It's just a rip-roaring fight, and I wanted the names to represent that. Now, if you're really going to use weird words, they have to mean something. I've played a lot of games. Lord of the Rings Online I love. I haven't played it in a while, but it's one of my favorites. And like 90% of the places are named like Das Vizib, and they don't have, I mean, they have rhyme or reason if you're a real Tolkien guy, but I guess I'm not, and I get lost and confused. They don't mean anything. So there's a worry that like, well, what does Almanach Show, the Tower Unparalleled mean? Well, you know what the last words mean, Tower Unparalleled. All the towers have these weird suffixes. And who built these towers? Like what happened? Like, who talks like this, right? There's someone from history that we don't quite understand created these things, and all we remember are the names. They feel different from regular dungeons. They're different to play, and they have different names, and they want to evoke something different that sticks to the tone. I've said that 30,000 times already, and I'm going to keep saying it, because that's important to this, to me. So now I'm going to go over some humor. Actually, they're just don'ts, really. There's no do's here. And full disclosure to everybody in the room, I'm not a master humorist, and I'll explain that I'm not, and you probably know I'm not if you played the game. But there's things I found that worked and didn't work for me, and there's traps I almost fell in, and I just want to share that. And there are people who make funny games that would look at this and be like, screw you, like this isn't for us, but for me it is. And for people who aren't fantastic writers, who want to try putting this stuff in their game, I think these tips might help. So the first, references shall be unnoticeable if not recognized. Man, there's nothing worse than reading something that's supposed to be funny and being like, I don't get it. I've never watched an episode of Doctor Who in my life, right? I know what a TARDIS is. It's what you go into and you come out as Superman, right? I know what one is, but I've never actually used one, and I haven't been to a Dragon Con and used one, so I don't know how they'd work in game. But when I see something like that, I'm like, oh, it's a Doctor Who. Okay. What's better, in my opinion, is if you reference something, if you don't know what it is, you don't care. It just goes over your head and it's fine and it doesn't disrupt your experience. So, a bad example from Dungeonmans, I think if you played it, how many Bothans do we have to slaughter to figure that out, right? I didn't put that line in the game, and I wouldn't, because if somebody doesn't know what a Bothan is, and there are people who've never seen Star Wars, that's like, what's a Bothan? And what, this is weird. And then now, Bothans are in Dungeonmans, right? Because I said they are, and that's something I don't want to do. So that kind of reference, it calls back to Star Wars, and it's funny, but it can miss. And that applies to all sorts of different types of humor. You want to call back something funny in the real world, but if you have to know what it is, you miss. So the good line is, many Scrollbolds died to bring this information, right? Scrollbolds are in Dungeonmans, and everyone knows what they are, and if you've never seen Star Wars, that's just a true thing, right? You just, oh, well, many Scrollbolds died to bring this information. But if you have seen Star Wars, you're like, oh, haha, lol. And you don't laugh very hard, because it's not very funny. Well, it's not, and that's actually something else with references, because they're not supposed to be the punchline, the mega funny, kill streak, this is the funniest thing, eat it. Like, that's not how these work, because your audience might just miss them, right? So you can't have your structure set up on them. The books in Dungeonmans that you use to gain skills, I pulled from stuff in the real world all the time. So if you've read Penn and Tiller's Cool Tricks for Dear Friends, the Tricksonometry book is got a funny name because it's about tricksy magic, and so are these guys, and oh, that's great. And if you haven't, then who cares? It's just a book, and you don't feel like you missed anything. Again, huge Robert E. Howard fan. It's so awesome. By this axe I rule, like the end of the story is like somebody couldn't marry somebody they wanted to, and it was written in these stone laws, and what he decided to do, he was just like, well, all these laws, and he took his axe and he's like, bah, and he crushes the stone tablet. By this axe I rule, and people can do what they want. And well, that's awesome. So by this axe I crush goes in, and if you've never heard of this, it doesn't matter. It doesn't bother you. Another thing I want to mention is the flavor text for the magic book says, oh yeah, the guy in the 3,000 gold piece caster robe is going to get hit by use crowds. Come on, and that, Arrested Development, right? Like Joe Bluth says that, and maybe 2 of you have seen that show. But if you don't know who Joe Bluth is, this goes over your head and it's fine. If you do know who it is, you're like, oh, that show is funny. What Dungeonmans doesn't have is a magician on a scooter showing up and being like, they're illusions, player name, and they're like, sure, that's funny if you've seen Arrested. Yeah, you laughed. There, good. If you've seen Arrested Development, that's funny. But the rest you haven't, and you're like, what is this? And it pulls you out of the game. Here's something that isn't funny, but still a reference. I was in martial arts in my youth, and then again in my early 20s. The Psychomancer is the monk class in Dungeonmans, and it does the wah-pa-ka, like the kick jumpy stuff, and it has like the ego bending teleportation. And I took this stuff because it was awesome to me, and I put it in the game. And the reason I mentioned it at all is because it had a consistent tone. And I was like, well, yes, there's a structure here that I'm going to lift and put into the game. So those are power names, and they're based on some of the virtues of the karate. I just took those. This text is probably too small to read, but the point being, the Karate Dojo was one of the books we had to read, and half of it was karate tall tales. Like, think Paul Bunyan, but instead about like ninja masters and such. And they were amazing. So the flavor text for the Psychomancer powers, right? The one where nothing is impossible teleports you somewhere else. And so the flavor text is, all her will and resolve to exist anew outside the very walls of the palace. The emperor, still entwined with what he believed to be his favorite new concubine, soon found himself embracing a pile of cold and feeling rice. So began the seasons of shameful grain. And it's like, what? What? You know, it's silly. But this one, I'm not going to read them all, but like they have the same rhythm. Like a thing happens, and then there's a twist at the end. And like that's how all those stories were. I grabbed it because it was consistent and met the tone. We shall play to our strengths when being funny. So I love making games. I've done it for a long time. I want to do it until my body falls apart. And I want to take risks, right? I want to push the boundaries, try stuff, do stuff, and put ourselves out there. Put ourselves at risk, right, that are creative. Well, don't do it when you're being funny. Because if someone says your game is unfunny, that sucks. It feels bad on the inside. And that's something, I mean, anybody who tries to be funny and they're called unfunny, that's terrible. So do what you do best. And I have strengths and weaknesses. And I knew that my strengths, okay, I can make snippy dialogue and describe things in a funny way and put these cool objects in the world. But I can't do long-form humor. And there's no like pratfall sketches that, I mean, some people could do that in cutscenes and make it hilarious. I can't. So I didn't, right? I knew these were weaknesses and I didn't want to fall flat there. Again, I'm encouraging people to push themselves in every aspect but humor because you have to be a little more safe. You will be safe and not be an edgy edgelord, okay? You can't do Lamar Jackson from Grand Theft Auto 5. You're not good enough. And people still think he's problematic, right? I mean, he's racist and terrible, and he says the worst things all the time. Other people think he's hilarious. So they kind of, like, they got a pass because they're like, this guy's so well written, but we just shouldn't do that, right? It doesn't work. It's jarring and awful, and you alienate very important people who are your customers, and don't, right? Just don't. The gaming audience is trending toward inclusiveness. It doesn't feel like it, right? But it is, and people are starting to realize, even if they're not on like the far spectrum of social justice, they're starting to realize, why am I excluding these people from my game? Why am I excluding them from the community? This isn't right. And we have these moments where we're like, I can't believe I said that when I was younger. Oh, I'll never do it again. And that's happening, and the audience is trending in that direction. And it will continue to do so, I hope, because edgy language doesn't work in long form. So Predator is an awesome action movie, right? I love it. And Jesse Ventura is this big pile of biceps, and he's got 12 machine guns, and he blows people apart, and then he also uses these homophobic pejoratives. And it's how they talked back then. He's talking to his fellow soldiers, and he's calling this and that. Watch it today, and it's like, when that happens, like, oh, you know. I read Robert E. Howard's stuff, and it was written in the 20s. And there is some pretty awful stuff, like the noble savage blacks, and I'm like, oh God, like, it doesn't hold up, right? So if you try to do edgy humor because my character has to do it, it's gonna fall flat in a short amount of time. So don't do it. We shall veer off course with great caution. You have a target, you set it, and you wanna say, well, I've got this funny thing, I'm gonna make it dark, and the player's gonna feel it. I don't think that's true. You have Borderlands, like, this is a funny, clever game. Oh man, this is really great, and suddenly, oh, your favorite bird from Borderlands 1 is now radiated. You have to kill it, and then the boss blows his head up right in front of you, and the person who owns the bird has to watch him die. And what the hell is this? And then another character gets shot out of nowhere, and like, it kind of worked for Wash and Firefly, but it didn't work here, right? It's just, and now, oh, the boss and the alien AI is actually his daughter, and everybody's got the feels. And if your audience wants this, great. But if they don't do it to them. And if you say, well, I'm going to just make this a serious story, you end up missing, I think, the power you have for making the target in the first place. So again, this is the end. This is the narrative from before, right? I beat the big boss and did the thing with the stars. This isn't funny. I mean, it's just not. So I said, what's the story of Dungeonmans? Players don't tell me funny things. That's fine, because the tone and humor in the game created that fertile environment for them to have a good time, to continue to play, to feel the adventure, and to make the player narrative this way. So that's what I got. Oh, hey, I'm shipping a game in like a week, right? The Monday after next, and maybe you guys could like tell your friends or buy it, or just boost those Steam keys from the bottom, right? Because I put like 6 up there if you want to play it right now in beta release. But yeah, that's what I got. That's Tone and Humor in Dungeonmans. Thank you for your attention. One question? Okay, we have 4 minutes for questions. Please ask a 3-minute question. You, sir.
So you said that you don't want to be called unfunny, but how do you write in such a way that with game reviews these days, especially on Steam and things like that, people like to be edgy in their reviews?
Yes.
So do you aim your writing for a certain set of people, or how do you deal with this in a mass market game situation?
Okay, so you asked, people like to be edgy in their game reviews, and they come at you like that. How do you create humor that isn't unfunny to those people, or do you pick a certain audience for that? My answer is, I did have an audience, and I tried to know what they would want, and I also just used the humor I have naturally, which again is limited to a subset of things based on running tabletop games and telling stories. You're not immune to people coming at you with bad reviews. It's going to happen, and like anything else, you QA this stuff. You run it by friends, like, is this funny? Does this work? Is this dumb? And you'll get that back. You have to study humor, right? Watch funny things, play funny games, read funny stuff, and say, what works for me? And pick that. And then, again, pick that target, right? Hone it down and say, this is what I'm going to do. Run it by friends. If it doesn't work, do something else. But if it does work, great. You've got something. Questions, please. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Talk about your game.
I'm happy to, if there's no questions about like the stuff I presented, because maybe somebody cares. Maybe somebody cares to ask a question. Sometimes I don't finish. Yes, sir.
A perverse incentive to ask about your other game.
Did I? Why? It's not even on screen anymore. So why would you want to look at that? There's nothing there. Oh, wow. Okay, this is an arcade game about a truck possessed by a demon that drives out of control. Some would call it an endless runner. I call it an immortal trucker. And you have a ram button and a shoot everything button, and you go real fast, and the levels are kind of randomized, the power-ups are randomized, and if your PC could take quarters, it'd be a quarter muncher. But you can't, so you can pay $4.99 for it, or you can wait for the Halloween sale and pay $6.66 for it. That's your choice. Yeah. Cool. Are we good? Anyone else? I mean, ask me anything. Don't. Yes, sir.
Are you going to make more Dungeonmans stuff?
I have patched Dungeonmans over the last 2 years. I put out new content, new classes. The Psychomancer was post-launch. And I have one more patch coming up for the end of October, which is the Wizardmans revamp. So Wizardmans is the oldest class, and it's kind of crufty by now. And I'm going to do some stuff with magic and put in some new monsters to crush and new loot and try to package it up real nice. And all the updates have been free. This one will be free as well. Cool. We're good? Thank you very much.